I'm very happy with our 4 remarkable speakers. So a warm welcome. Due to your experience, I'm very curious to learn more about the different layers you approach in your daily work. So in the recent years, there have been done many empirical studies on an inclusive security approach, and that the studies showed that an inclusive approach can fundamentally change the dynamics and outcomes of peace processes and conflict prevention. So and maybe it's even important to mention at the beginning, although we will also talk about women inclusion, the inclusive security approach doesn't only refer to women, and as we just learned, it also includes the society, civil society as a whole, and minorities, other minority groups, ethnic diversity, religion, so on and so forth. However, the empirical research that has been done so far concentrated much on the women's inclusion. And for example, research tells us that women can prevent violence, provide security, moderate extremism, and strengthening peacekeeping. And it is often stated that gender equality in a state is a much better indicator of a state's peacefulness than its GDP, religion, or even state of democracy. So, and to do this knowledge justice, there have been so many efforts in the past decades to really to recognize this importance of an inclusive security approach, and also the State Secretary Sybille mentioned this morning the United Nations Resolution 1325. And with this reference, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sybille Fezer. Welcome. You're a women's rights defender at Medica Mondiale, which is an internationally renowned women's rights and aid organization, which was established in 1993. And you established the organization's programs in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Liberia, and northern Iraq. So my introductory question for you would be, so how does an inclusive security approach from the perspective of a feminist women rights organization look like, really on the ground, and keeping the United Nations resolution in our back mind? What did it really do? And we heard about also the action plans that are soon to be followed, but really, what are the facts on the ground from your perspective?
Thank you. As we have only 5 minutes, I thought I'll just kind of give some snapshots about our approach. And as you already said, the inclusive security means that really all segments of society have to be included. And when we talk about, you were saying, of course, my focus will be on women, but it's not only about women, because women can be very different. From all our experience, elite women in the cities have often very many other concerns than women from rural areas. So what we do to make, in the countries we work in, to really kind of give women access to decision making, and also working against violence against women, which is a hindering factor for women to participate at all in any kind of peace building efforts or conflict transformation efforts. We have developed a multi-layered approach, a multi-level approach that goes from the individual to family, community level, to institutional level, to political level. And then one thing that's very important, and I hope in the 5 minutes I will be able to also talk about this, is the societal level, or what we would call deep-rooted beliefs, stereotypes, narratives about societies and about gender and about the othering, the other people. So we try to focus on all this, and to make it very practical, I'll try to show it through a woman that I got to know in Liberia. Her name is Mabel, and so I'll kind of give a very short thing, like on each level, what would security mean for her, and what we encountered there when I was working there. So Mabel, on an individual level, she has been heavily traumatized during the war. She has been raped. Many of her family members have been killed. So after the war, she actually was not able to really participate in the life of her family and community. She was not able to look after herself. And her security concerns now were, how can I get kind of help, support, access to health, access to how can I get my children in school and how can I cope with all what I did. Her basic needs needed to be fulfilled in order for her to participate in any kind of decision making, even at village level. So what we then, with our colleagues and our partner organizations abroad, do is to help her access health services, to provide psychosocial services for her, and to help her negotiate her own needs in her family and at best in her community as well. So moving to the community and the family level, our experience shown, and we did one more in-depth research in Bosnia about this, that when women are recognized with all what happened to them, with the rape they suffered, by their communities, and if, for example, religious authorities or any other kind of authority recognize what happened to her as a real human rights violation, then those women have a far bigger chance to cope with what happened to them. So what does it mean on a family, a community level? We have to work with men as well to make them aware. We have to make gender training with them, to make them aware of the atrocities that happened, and also to, at times our colleagues, they find very clever ways how to do it. They do gender training in a way that men and women would change roles and really try to be in the other one's shoes and learn about what is the life looking like from a perspective of a woman. And another thing that we did is, because the solidarity that the women experience on the ground really helped them to cope with what happened and make them more apt and more able to participate in communal life, is that we have built up solidarity networks in Liberia. That means that many women kind of build groups and help each other and are aware when there is a violence going on in some area. They come, they stand by the women and they help her to take a decision about what she can do next, whether she wants to go to the police or whether she needs to go to the health center. She will be supported. Now, on institutional level, with Mabel, there was a very shocking example for me. The former perpetrator that raped her during the war was still in the village where she was living. He was a policeman, and now from the analysis, what happened is there was a vetting done. So photos of people who applied for police services were put all over. I could see them in the blackboards put there. But if those who define what vetting means are not aware of what it means for women, what security means for women, what women's view is on police, then if the monitoring is not done also through a female gendered lens, then the vetting process would not be effective, and in this case it wasn't. So that is something we also try to work on with our partner organizations and women's activists on the ground, to really have them involved in those kind of decision-making processes, so that they also can define what security means for a woman. And of course, if in the society, if in the village, violence against women is something perceived as normal, they wouldn't see this as a vetting, as an element to vet against. Now, do I have still? A minute? Okay. So I'll jump to the societal level, because that's, as I said, something important for us, is that, of course, if those who go abroad and are the so-called peacemakers, if those are not reflecting themselves, reflecting on their own power over others they have, not reflect their own also privileges they have when they go abroad and work in another country, as we saw now with the 8-2 scandal that I think some of you are aware, where we know that UN peacekeeping forces, but as well aid organizations also had raped women, and this scandal came alongside with the Me Too debate. If that is not happening, these self-reflective elements are not happening, then we cannot claim to contribute to peace building, because if we do not have that lens and reflect ourselves in the way where do we ostracize others, where do we have our own biases, then we will not be able to do real peace. And so I think, and we try to also lobby with the German government and wherever we are with other humanitarian organizations to really build up programs where gender training and the gender transformative training is there. And it's not only about men and women, but it's really about different, in fact, it's what we heard just in the big audience. It's about power analysis as well. Who am I and where stand I and where do I display oppression against others, and where am I privileged?
Thank you very much. So I would like to give the floor now to our next speaker, Julie. You work for the working group FriEnt on peace and development, and this is a working group constituted of governmental organizations, political foundations, church development agencies, and civil society networks. Before your current position, you also were in the field. You spent several years in Africa, and you worked for Safer World also in Nepal, working on peace promotion, conflict resolution, and gender. So we heard so much about the individual level. Maybe going a step further and taking a look at the local level of the civil society where these international organizations work with. I mean, when we approach this inclusive security programs, what does it do and what does it mean for those institutions, security institutions, that are supposed to implement this inclusive approach? I mean, just considering also African countries with traditional hierarchies, cultural structures, tribal structures. So what does it really mean for them to implement an inclusive approach?
Thank you, Anna. I actually link it very closely to what you've just shared, because I think it's at the local institutional level of formal institutions, but also informal institutions and of the community. And I think if we talk about, I think the title of this breakout group is Future of Inclusive Security. I think what we're talking about are actually things that have been practiced and researched already for a long time, but still I think they're not being done enough, so it would be really important in the future to look at those aspects a little bit more. What does it actually look like? So when you, I think you're working mainly with women, but also when you work with communities, with local police and administration stakeholders. I mean, the concept, or one way to do it is fairly simple. So you bring the people together, people from different groups in the community. You bring the police, local administration, maybe informal stakeholders, peace committees, and so on. You sit together, identify security issues, discuss them, and decide what to do, and then you develop a plan that's then being implemented by the police, or some aspects can be taken up by the community, whatever it looks like. Depends very much on the context, and you need to work very closely. It needs to come from the local context. You can't take it from outside and implement it. So that sounds fairly simple, but it's actually usually complex. And you already pointed out some of the issues that are behind that, because we are dealing with people with, for example, women in a rural village in Tajikistan who are not supposed to think about security issues. They're not supposed to talk about them, and definitely not in public, definitely not in a room with men. We talk about Dalits who are seen as outcasts in Nepal. They are not supposed to have their voices heard. What do you do with young men in South Sudan? They're seen as a security threat rather than as someone you discuss security with. And or with a Catholic in Northern Ireland who, until recently, the police service in Northern Ireland was very much dominated by Protestants. So the police was maybe more seen as a security risk, or as someone on the side of the enemy. So what you need to do is to share, and similarly from the side of the police as well, there are of course grievances. So if you need to provide a lot of information and capacity building, so you need to think about, okay, what does security mean for me? What does it mean for others? To get these very diverse dimensions of security. But also going beyond that, what are my rights? And how can I voice what I feel? How can I speak in public? How can I analyze a situation? So do I feel comfortable talking in front of men, for example, about security issues that affect the community? How do you participate in meetings? So it's really building that up from the ground, building confidence. But you also need to create the acceptance in society that actually a woman who is sitting in a room with men to talk about security issues is not promiscuous. That a man who's discussing issues with women doesn't lose his social status because he's only supposed to discuss those issues with men, or that someone from one group in society in a polarized situation is not seen as a traitor because he or she is discussing the issues with people from the other group. So that's really a transformative process. You talked about transformation as well in society that you start. Then you need to create fora where people feel comfortable to discuss those issues in a non-violent, peaceful way. So it's very much also about learning it, or again, particularly in conflict or post-conflict situations, in polarized situations, learning again how to address things constructively and having democratic elements already in that process. What does it mean for security providers? I think if you look at security providers, very often they are very strictly hierarchical structured and very top-down. So it's difficult, like any shift in such and they have their own cultural and institutional culture, so it's often very difficult to shift such an institution. They are often, the staffing is fairly male, often dominated by one or two ethnic groups. And to change the staffing structure, we heard about that in the morning, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. You need to change the culture within the institution, but you also need to make sure that society accepts that a woman is now joining the police, or that someone from a specific ethnic group is now joining the army, particularly if it's not running in the family. It's not like, grandfather has been a police officer, mom has been, and the uncle has been in the army, but it's actually something that is usually posted or filled by another ethnic group or religious group, and so on and so forth. Then there are these issues that seem banal. How do you make sure that there's a toilet for women, shower for women, sleeping quarter for women? How do we address issues of sexual orientation? But then also what I found in Nepal, for example, a commander of a police unit came to me and said, so we now have women in our local police. How do I talk to them? I know how to give orders to a male police officer, but I don't know how to talk to a female police officer. So it's those tiny issues that we often forget, and particularly I think when we're sitting in the West and we're discussing what an excellent strategy could look like, these are details that are absolutely important, but we very often forget about them. And I think it's really absolutely crucial that you take the police, you take the communities with you, but you also take the police or the army or whoever you engage with you, and you do it with them and not on them, because they have experience. They've gone often through grievances. They've been on one side of the conflict. They have also faced hostilities from the community. And you need to have the political will both at the local level and at the national level.
Thank you very much. So I probably don't have to introduce you to our next speaker, Dr. Almut Wieland-Karimi. She's the executive director of the Center for International Peace Operations, and before that she worked for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Washington, Argentina, and you built up the program in Afghanistan. So we heard about the national level. So and you touched upon the issue of institutional culture, staffing structure, that they need to be changed. So from the perspective of an international organization, what kind of challenges do you observe to implement this inclusive security approach?
Well, thank you very much, and let me start by saying that I'm really very happy to be here. It is a privilege to see so many wonderful women, also men. And it's actually the good news to attend a security conference that does not focus on nuclear warheads and the size of troops. I've been to many of those. Mostly, actually, it was the other way around. There was maybe one or two other women in the room. So I think it's a big achievement of WIIS and all of us that we're talking about an inclusive approach to security, and that we look at an issue that is crucial to all human beings on this earth from a much wider angle. And I think it's great that this conference is exploring how all these issues are interrelated, although in some cases might be a little bit more difficult. What I would like to try today is to focus on the issue of elections, because as you might know, I work for the Center for International Peace Operations, and what we do, we have kind of an inclusive, that's how we call it, approach to peace operations. We work with the United Nations, the European Union, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also with NATO, African Union and others. And we have an analysis section, but we also have training. We have a section on international capacity development, and we send out about 160 people, civilian experts, how we call them, to field operations, long-term operations, and between 300 and 400 electoral observers. Why we do that? Because we believe, and well, being an organization that belongs to the Federal Foreign Office, I think we believe that elections are very important, democratic institution in all countries. For some it is a big achievement, and I'm sure Mariam Safi will talk a little bit about these issues from her perspective. For others it's a little bit neglected issue, I would have to say, although the topic of elections are so important, not only to democracy, but for sure it's also very closely related to the question of human security of people living in a certain area. I was struck by a speech of Kofi Annan that he gave in Munich early this year. You might know that he passed away, may he rest in peace. He was really one of the really VIP, well-understanding people in the field of the United Nations as the former Secretary General. And he asked a question in Munich whether tweets might have become mightier than swords, which is an interesting thought, talking about security. So when we talk about technical development, I think in the field of mobilization in many societies, this is a big opportunity. Just look at the recent history. I mean, we would understand that, for example, during the popular uprising in Iran, 2009, social media played a crucial role. The same is true to the Maidan in Ukraine, 2013, 2011 to the Arab Spring, as we know, with a very difficult outcome. We could mention Ushahidi. You might know this organization. They play a big role in Kenya. And when there were riots around the elections, they always used social media to warn people, especially women, to not go to certain areas because there was violence. There was also violent security forces in the country. So they have helped a lot, also to enable people, but mainly women, to participate in elections, because we know it is in many places it's dangerous to participate in an election. And therefore a second very important element is that you can use social media for your campaigning if you're a candidate. And you would find out that it's not only in remote places, but also in places where candidates are threatened because the other candidates who don't want them, they can use social media platforms in order to campaign. And this does not only take place in conflict countries, but for example, the latest elections in the US, only 2 weeks ago, you would see how many women won there in the elections and how much they used social media in order to make people vote, bring out the vote, but then also to get their issues out to the voters. So it has been used, social media and the technological progress, in a very positive way. However, there's a long list I could think of if we come to the threats of technological change in this area. For example, there are many authoritarian regimes who are cracking down on the freedom of the internet. And at the same time, they use the hackers and their trolls. So that is very difficult to differentiate whether it's fake news, true news. And of course, since you're not dealing with human beings anymore, and it's so advanced, and we lag behind in doing the capacity building for understanding what is the right news coming from the ones campaigning and what are the trolls and hackers, it can of course be abused in an electoral campaign, and I think this is true in many places in elections. And while there's some who say it was the Russians who intervened in the American elections, but also in the French and German elections, but there's also the other side saying the Russians that we very much intervened with the so-called colored revolution in Ukraine and Georgia. So the West used the social media for that. So it has become a tool of conflict. And there's another downside to it. I think on the one hand side it's great that the social media enables a kind of movement. However, what we have found is that in many places these movements don't have a leader. Egypt is a good point in case. This Egyptian revolution, bringing down the former dictator President Mubarak in a short time, it was enabled by young people, men, women, through a social media movement, and they also then physically gathered at the Tahrir Square. But since it was an equal movement, same eye level, there was no vetting by parties. I think you mentioned that. They didn't bring about the real leader for this, and then the whole campaign collapsed. I mean, I make a very long story short. I apologize for everyone who's an expert on Egypt. I just wanted to make my point, why it also has its downsides. And of course, there's something that is especially targeting women, is the hate speech and mobbing in the internet. There has been a report by the European Union that especially women suffer from this mobbing and hate speech, and mostly the strategy is just to go out of these social media platforms and not get involved anymore. So the threatening does work. And last but not least, one more threat or downside is, of course, with the social media and also with populist movement growing, we have more and more these small ideological echo chambers of people thinking that only their in-group in the internet knows the truth, the reality, whatever that is, and then thinks that if you are involved in discussing issues in this echo chamber you have, there's no need anymore to participate in elections. I think it's mistaken that you cast a ballot or put a like on the Facebook, and that is an issue I think we have to raise awareness on. I think probably more than 5 minutes, and I'm happy to pass on to you, back to you, Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, again, pointing out that every technological process has always positive side or a negative side. We will maybe go deeper into the discussion in a few minutes. You do training and advocacy programs that aim to provide policymakers, decision makers with sound alternative solutions to national issues. And you were honored in 2014 by the Diplomatic Courier Media Network as one of their top global women. So despite the progress that has been made in Afghanistan since 2001, we talked about it last night, the situation, the momentum which we had a few years ago is gone, we have to say. It's still a major conflict zone, which leads to killings also of many civilians. I think in 2017 over 1,000 women have been killed. And in March this year, you gave a speech in the UN Security Council on current trends and developments. So maybe you can just wrap up shortly for us. What did you tell the UN Security Council on current trends, and what went wrong?
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here with you all. In terms of what went wrong, one of the things that I mentioned at the UN Security Council was that in the earlier part of the international intervention in Afghanistan, whether you would call it state building, peace building, stabilization, counterinsurgency, so many different words have been used for it. You can pick whichever one you'd like. Nobody's really clear on exactly which one it is till date. But there was hope amongst Afghans. There was hope because we held elections for the very first time in the history of the country in 2004. So there was hope that democracy is coming into into Afghanistan. We will have democratic structures of governance. We will have human rights. We will have transparency. We will have legitimacy. And that this would open a new chapter for Afghanistan. And I don't want to say that it has not opened a new chapter. It certainly has, because the Afghanistan of today is not the Afghanistan of 2001 by any means. However, the gains that we have made in the last 17, 18 years are extremely fragile. And the concerns that we see today instill within us the fear that we may go back. Now, why are we in this position, and why haven't we strengthened from hope to hope? Well, one, there was no inclusive security approach. Let's just put that out there. So my talk today will focus a little bit on why there wasn't, where there were attempts at inclusive security, where they failed, and what changes were made to try to adapt quickly to address those challenges, and continue the state building effort in Afghanistan, in the hopes that it might shed some light as to where we are now, to show where we may be going in the next, let's say, decade or two. In 2014, former President Barack Obama, said that the United States would be leaving behind 9,800 troops after 2014 to help train the Afghan National Security Forces. At the same time, he was also quick to caution that Afghanistan will not be a perfect place, and that it was not America's responsibility to make it one. The same sentiment, interestingly, was reiterated by President Trump when he was elected and he presented his Afghanistan and South Asia strategy. He said the exact same thing. Now, to us Afghans, civil society members, think tankers, even policymakers, we thought to ourselves, it was the US and NATO partners who assumed full ownership of Afghanistan's state building process from the beginning, since 2001. And offered little space for Afghans to influence this process. But now, as the challenges are mounting internally, both in the US and in Europe, all of a sudden we are seeing this preparation to leave Afghanistan. All of a sudden we're hearing sentiments of local ownership in this handover of responsibility. Handover of a responsibility to a people who were never prepared to assume that responsibility. This happened, the preparing or the training for assuming responsibility came way too late into the process of the international intervention. And now we find ourselves given this responsibility, whether it be political, whether it be security, whether it be development, amidst an environment where we are now not only fighting one insurgency, but over 20 regional international terrorist organizations, where it was only one in 2001, right? We have an extremely deepening economic crisis in the country that was superficially facilitated by donor funding, which has now decreased, so that gap is becoming more and more visible to us. We have mass migration. We have issues, of course, of criminality and corruption and narcotics trade and all of those various factors. And within this, we have to assume the state building agenda now. Now, in terms of how we got here, regardless of the overarching vision, it took considerable time for all countries to find an organizational form of intra-agency cooperation that could guide the national efforts in Afghanistan. Moreover, it seems that the various forms that did eventually emerge did not significantly challenge or dismiss existing administrative boundaries. Because the overall trend of, in terms of bringing together civil-military efforts was something that basically took this form. It was off to a weak start, and then a certain reapproachment along the way to fix whatever mistakes that were happening. But then ultimately the outcome that we saw from these differing or new approaches taken midway into the international intervention was one that brought very few lasting institutional changes. Now, these divisions, and particularly when I'm talking about divisions, I'm talking about, when I'm saying there was no inclusive security approach, I'm looking at two things. One, the diverging and often contradicting approaches taken by the United States and NATO partners and EU alliances. And the second, lack of local ownership in this process. So when you have on the one hand NATO and ISAF in the divisions between them, this impeded efforts to establish and maintain an effective and legitimate Afghan state structures. The contradictions that emerged from this lack of inclusive security in Afghanistan was a few. There's many, but I want to highlight 4. The creation of a highly centralized state in a country with little experience of such a centrifugal system. Hybrid peace building, where old and new systems of rule of law, policing, making decisions on national issues took place. When I say hybrid peace building, what I'm talking about is in Afghanistan, in the beginning, it was your very typical liberal peace building intervention. That was the agenda. But later on, when they realized, oh, we need local ownership here, then what they started doing, the international community as a whole, was using everybody and every concept. So you had the conservative, the modern, the progressive, the traditional, you had the power brokers, the warlords, you had women's groups, you had civil society, you had tribal elders. So you had a mishmash. What did this mishmash create? I'll give you a few examples. So you have, for example, in Afghanistan, a very strong emphasis on rule of law, which is the foundation of peace building. One of the foundations is bringing in rule of law. Well, when we brought the rule of law into Afghanistan initially, then we started thinking, okay, we need to start also maybe strengthening those local structures, those informal local traditional structures of conflict resolution. Like we've got, they're called Council of Wise Men, Jirgas and Shuras. So they did that. They strengthened them. They strengthened them with the hope that one day we will link this to the formal justice sector, which hasn't happened as of yet. There's still an attempt that's ongoing. But what you have happen now is you have a formal rule of law system, but you also have traditional councils that not only resolve civil disputes, but also resolve criminal disputes, which they are not supposed to, right? So that's one example. Another example, when you have national issues in a country like Afghanistan, where you have 3 branches of government, you have a legislature, you have a parliament there. So national issues can go into parliament and parliament can make decisions. Well, in Afghanistan, you also have something called the Grand Council, the Loya Jirga. Now, the Grand Council, when convened by the president or the people, can bring about all representatives from the subnational level of these smaller Council of Wise Men that I just mentioned. And when they get together, they can make any decisions, whether it is on the constitution or on any national issue. Okay, so now you've got a parliament here, and the parliament's thinking, well, you know, here we are. Now, what are we here for when you can convene a Loya Jirga at any point in time? That's second example of this hybrid peace building model. A third example of hybrid peace building is in Afghanistan, into the counterinsurgency efforts or stabilization efforts, what you start seeing happening was the forces thinking to themselves, we need to strengthen community policing forces because we don't have enough, we don't have enough Afghan National Army forces to send all across the country. The insurgency is growing in numbers, so how can we tackle them? Let's create a local police initiative. This local police initiative that was then brought about was given counterinsurgency training instead of training to protect the civilian population. This created, as you can imagine, so many difficulties, particularly for the women in these communities. So then you have a former police, and then you also have these local police initiatives. These are 4 examples that I'm giving you of hybrid peace building, to which we don't know the actual results. We will only know the actual results in about a decade or 2 or 3 when we do an assessment once international intervention has completed in Afghanistan, to find out what is this. But Afghanistan is in my knowledge, on the literature on peace building, the very first example of a hybrid peace building scenario that has emerged. And third, local ownership in Afghanistan was basically utilized as a tool to support elites, power brokers, war criminals, human rights violators, instead of bringing about horizontal local ownership at the very beginning stage. So initially what you had is a very elite-centric international intervention or application of local ownership. Then later on, you had a horizontal. But sometimes, sometimes it's a little too late. That's what sort of happened in Afghanistan. And so now you do have both the top and you have the horizontal being used at the same time. But you also have mounting number of challenges as well. That's why you can't see the benefits of it. And lastly, the usage of illiberal means to bring about liberal democracy. We've seen this in other contexts prior to Afghanistan, and we've also seen it happen in Afghanistan, particularly in the social contract that was developed between locals and members of the international community, whether that would be EU, NATO, ISAF alliance, the United States, all of these various actors. These social contracts that were created, whether it be a development initiative or a security or a political, at many times you often found the international community negotiating a contract in which the principles did not really fall align with liberal democratic principles. However, certain concessions were made in the hopes that later on in the future, we will be able to bring about liberal democracy. Now, has that happened in the social contracts that I have seen in Afghanistan? Once again, I don't know, because it's too early to make that call, and we can only do that with time. I have 1 minute, and I am only on page 1 of my speech. So there is a lot here that I'm going to skip. But what I would like to say to you today, I'll go straight to recommendations, and I can answer any questions you may have. In terms of bringing out inclusive security, there was this question in the agenda: is there a need for an overhaul of the U.S. and NATO alliance? Perhaps is there a need, perhaps, an overhaul of the alliance itself? What I would say in the context of Afghanistan right now, ISAF, NATO and the United States have been on completely different views from the beginning. When the US wanted a quick transformation in Afghanistan, a quick state building agenda, the EU cautioned and said, no, we need to make sure that this is a sustainable, transformative process of state building. But unfortunately, both of these visions clashed quite often. Now, in terms of the security sector, while EU was looking at stabilization efforts, the US was looking at counterinsurgency and coin and all of these various tactics, and they bumped heads consistently. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing some effective strategies at the security level in Afghanistan. On the political front, I will highlight the peace process to you all. In Afghanistan, European countries have long said that we need a political dialogue to facilitate any security initiatives we take. But it wasn't until 2010 when the United States was ready to say, okay, because they were preparing to leave Afghanistan. And so they said, okay, now maybe we should talk to the Taliban because apparently we're not defeating them anytime soon. So in this process, they officially supported then President Karzai's Peace and Reconciliation Initiative. And that was the first time the international community all came onto the same page, something that the European nations had wanted for a long time, that yes, let's talk to the Taliban and offer them a seat at the table to talk about these issues. And that's what happened. However, right now, as I speak to you, where we're finding ourselves on the Afghan peace process is certain elements within the Trump administration a little bit afraid now of what may happen in terms of US politics. And so they're thinking complete withdrawal is just around the corner. So before that happens, let's give the US administration something tangible to keep them into Afghanistan for a little while longer until we sort of tie up loose ends. So what that means is the United States at the present moment has been rushing with the Afghan peace process to such an extent where there are even talks, perhaps rumors, but also talks from the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also on the peace process, that we may not have presidential elections next year. Because one of the conditions for the Taliban coming onto the negotiation table is the development of an interim government. Now, I know that for the EU, this is very concerning. For the EU, the suggestion is that we support an inclusive approach to the peace process. Let's have a government, let's have a newly established presidential government in Afghanistan elected that can lead this peace process. And they're cautioning their counterparts in the US, saying that let's ensure that this is a sustainable process. Let's not move so quickly just so we can appease a certain group of individuals, because we're afraid that if they leave, everything in Afghanistan is going to crumble at this stage. So that's where we're finding ourselves right now, for example, in the Afghan peace process. So these diverging views at all times shows to us that perhaps the alliance we may not be able to get the alliance and the various actors in Afghanistan that are important to the conflict on the same table on all of these matters. However, the people of Afghanistan have very specific recommendations for the European Union and NATO alliance itself. I just want to read a few of these very quickly to you. These recommendations were from consultations with about over 22 civil society organizations that NATO civilian representative offered the platform to us to then express them. And it was also taken into consideration in the NATO conference that just passed. For one, it was the first recommendation was for NATO allies, particularly the Office of the Special Civilian Representative for Resolute Support, to take steps to deepen its engagement in support of grassroots consensus building amongst all sectors of Afghan society on key concerns related to the peace process, such as the timing of negotiations, red lines for negotiations, the role of justice in eventual settlement, the protection and role of women, and the way forward after a peace agreement is reached. Second, Afghan women have contributed greatly in the reconstruction of Afghanistan since 2001. Their roles and perspectives as community peace builders and national mediation and negotiation experts has been vital in promoting inclusivity and sustainable peace. We believe the implementation of NAP 1325 is essential to operationalize the meaningful participation and inclusion of women in the peace and security agenda in Afghanistan. And we call upon NATO allies to contribute towards its effective implementation through their engagement with the Afghan government and relevant stakeholders. Third, good neighborly relations and regional cooperation is essential for security and stability of Afghanistan. However, NATO and Afghan forces continue to battle terrorist organizations that receive and support safe havens in the region. Here, NATO allies were urged to tie their economic and military aid in the region to the progress made by regional actors in curtailing terrorist safe havens in the region. Now here, the important thing I want to highlight is that one of the things that consistently came out in our deliberations with civil society organizations was that NATO and ISAF countries need to define their relationship with Afghanistan's neighbors, which is something that the alliance has shied away from doing for a very long time. And this definition is extremely important. It shows the Afghan people where the alliance stands vis-a-vis countries where we feel that terrorists or safe havens are being supported, and also in developing a cohesive, a regional approach to security, for example. And I will end there.
Sorry, because it's so fascinating and interesting, but we only have 20 minutes left. Thank you very much. We only have 20 minutes left for the whole discussion. I want to save some time for Q&A and in about 5 to 8 minutes. So please, I already invite you to think about your questions. You mentioned in your talk the bridge or the difficulties of connecting, what's happening on a local community level and also on a national governmental level. And maybe that's also a question I can ask you, Julie. So how do we deal with governments who are even not willing to implement an inclusive approach due to own interest, being afraid that, traditional civil society structures will deteriorate? How can we bridge this gap in some cases?
Thanks for the question, which is a difficult question, because
Yes.
I think it really depends on why actually a government is reluctant to follow an inclusive security approach. If there's just no political, because people say we want to keep the status quo as it is, I think we very often are in a situation where I think external actors, external governments, international organization, they want to achieve something and they push very much, and then there are concessions with the government on the other side, and I think the wishful thinking that, okay, if this government we want to cooperate with, if they make some small concessions and we have a compromise as well, and then in the end, yes, they will change the way they are doing their work, they will change the way security is provided, the way we think it should be done, and I think that's very often not the case. So I think it's one thing if they are legitimate concerns. And I think some of the issues, for example, what you mentioned about like, how do we deal with traditional structures? How do we deal, I mean, the communities, the society in countries, they are not homogeneous. There are very different views, and they are very often very polarized, particularly after conflicts. So there might be very legitimate concerns by governments. The timing is crucial as well. So can you address those concerns? Can you maybe think about, okay, what is the right way to go about reforming security provision in a way that makes it more inclusive, more related to human security, and so on and so forth. And I think then you can work in partnership with the governments on that. I think if there's just like, we don't really want this, and you follow this wishful thinking thing, oh, they will change over time, I think that's very often just not happening. And then we see processes that go wrong, and we have seen them so often that governments, security providers have been strengthened with equipment and so on and so forth. And in the end, that has been used against the people. It the security provision has not reformed in a way towards a democratic and human security-oriented way of providing security. So I think then external actors have to think very, very carefully, are we actually taking that risk, or are we not? And what do we want to achieve? Do we have a theory of change, a credible theory of change? And is that a theory of change that our partner government is also embracing? And how about civil society? And I think this consulting, really a broad range of actors, experts from different sectors, civil society from the country you want to partner with, but also really listening to those, the voices from people from very different groups is absolutely crucial. I think security experts in Berlin or Washington or in a capital, they're also important. They have a lot to say, but they can't be the only source of information.
I would like to pick up your phrase of hybrid peace building, which I liked very much. From a management perspective, Ms. Wieland-Karimi, would you agree that there is a lack of coordination, not only coordination, but really the question, what would we want to achieve and how do we achieve it in the long term, in the short term? Also thinking about what you just mentioned about, for example, what's going on in Libya. How are we dealing internationally with a state where we really don't have insights or a clue how to deal with different structures, even that as a European Union, we don't have a common ground of how to proceed there. So would you agree, is there a lack of coordination even between big players such as the US and the EU? Is it a common thing we observe globally and in other countries except than in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, let me say, Mariam, Safi, there was a great speech. It was a great summary, and I think you have been very polite. I mean, to label it hybrid peace building sounds like a great, it's the terrible contradictions, it's the mistakes we made on the ground. And the mistakes are really between the totally different approaches. So as an answer to your question, talking, for example, about the police, since Germany has been involved, you might recall Germany had the lead on capacity building of the Afghan police. We sent 12 brave policemen and women in order to build the police of a country. That was the starting point. And then, of course, being German, that took at least 3 years to build this police person. Unfortunately, the country was in a difficult situation, so it took too long. Then the Americans came in, actually American soldiers, military, and knowing that there was a problem, then they started to do capacity building for the police. 6 weeks, military, training Afghans in order to become police. So now you understand, you have this German-trained police person, and you have this American-trained police person. They couldn't really communicate with each other. So calling this hybrid peace building is polite of you. And I think I totally agree. One of the biggest issues in the international approaches are that we have different perspectives. First of all, we do lack the shared conflict analysis. It's a theory of change, Julie has mentioned, but it starts even earlier, the conflict analysis. What is the problem in a country? And usually, we don't agree. And this will become even more complex. In the past, there has been the Americans, and has been the European Union to a certain extent, but those were the main players on the ground. But now in many places you would find out there are even more players from Asia, from Africa. There's government agencies, there are non-government agencies, there's business. So it's getting more and more complex, and the more complex it gets, the more difficult it is to have this common conflict analysis. So we arrive at the same place, but we do different things. The other big issue in that is the question you raised about the short-term perspective or long-term perspective. Talking about this new peace initiative in Afghanistan, there might be the idea that that this one Afghan American wants to make peace quickly, make a tick mark. That might even happen very quickly, actually, more quickly than we could even witness. But at the end of the day, it will not be an inclusive peace agreement. At the end of the day, it will not be a sustainable peace agreement. So there will be less fighting for a while, but it's not sustainable. And you would find all these people working in peace mediation, all the experts on the ground who have worked in many conflict settings, they would all tell you you need an inclusive, sustainable peace agreement, but that takes a long time. You need to have women at the table, you need to include all other community groups. If you don't have that, it's not going to work. Plus at this point, since we're at the WIIS conference, I should also mention it's not only having women at the negotiation tables, but also all evidence shows that these peace agreements are more sustainable. So if in this case this American comes, makes peace, this is a short-term perspective. The Americans might be able to withdraw more soldiers, but they will have to resend them eventually one day, or somebody else will take over. So it is really, really complex on the ground, and I do admit there was one parliamentarian from Afghanistan. She once told me, if you invite me for dinner, but if you put too many ingredients into the pot, then you spoil the broth, and you can't eat it anymore. So it is very difficult, and of course this whole issue about coordination. I mean, there is this very famous saying, everybody wants to coordinate, but nobody wants to be coordinated. And then the question is, who has the ownership in this case? And in often case we go to a conflict country, then we would, for example, claim there should be local ownership, it should be the government or a network of civil society actors in a certain place, but of course they at that moment lack the capacity to coordinate because they don't have the experience. So it is really a difficult dilemma, and for sure we do lack coordination, but what is even worse, we lack the common analysis and especially the objectives.
So I would like to open up the floor now for questions. Keep it short because we only have 10 minutes, and maybe we can collect a few, so raise your hand. The floor.
Hi, I'm Nahid Shahalimi. I would like to ask the question maybe to both of you. I was there on the 8th of March when you gave that talk to the Security Council. Now, March and today are completely two different times, and that's the mobility of things it's moving so fast that I agree to the fact, thank you very much for saying that we cannot go in with a white flag in a place like Afghanistan and cry freedom or democracy because they have no idea what we're talking about. It's a different language that we speak. Thank you. What I want to know, and I would like to talk, I would like you to say a little bit about the spaces, the gaps that are closing down when it comes, because we're talking about women here, specifically in the peace process, and what the Taliban are asking, coming on that table of peace, at what cost? And I would like to know whether it is still the same thing, which was horrible, or has it gotten worse? When it comes to women, and especially we want something sustainable, which I don't think is going to ever happen. And the fragility of all of those things. That would be really nice to talk about that.
Thank you. I agree with your points. Management of expectations, absolutely. Management of expectations, and also the narrating of expectations to a local population when you're entering. Big promises were made, hence that hope. But eventually when that didn't materialize on the ground, that was one of the reasons why you had a Taliban regime turn into an insurgency. after 2003, when the local population's most basic needs were still not being met, 2004, 5, 6, it was at that point in time where you had a lot of the local population start moving towards the Taliban, saying, nothing's really improved, nothing's really changed, and hence the light bulb goes off. Oh well, here we are. We can have an insurgency now because we have lots of local support. And when we're talking about the reason why I was mentioning ISAF and NATO so much is because I didn't get to the rest of my 3-4 pages, was because I was going to give 2 particular examples, one of which Dr. Karimi pointed out, which was the lead nation strategy. If you want to assess the different and opposing views between the United States, which is a dominant key player, of course, after 9/11, the intervention in Afghanistan, so their role was quite large, and the European nations' role in Afghanistan under NATO and ISAF. You want to see where they oppose? Look at 2 areas. One, the lead nation strategy, which gave different European countries responsibility for different sectors of the security sector reform policy. So Germany had the development of the police, Americans had the development of the National Army, the Italians had the development of rule of law in the country, etc., etc. And each of them had their own different agendas, different timings, different funding and all, okay? And the second that you must look at is the construction of provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan, PRTs, which was eventually shut down by President Karzai, and rightfully so. The provincial reconstruction teams was supposed to be the most integrated framework for civil-military relations, or the most integrated approach to security in Afghanistan, and it was an utter failure. Not only was it an utter failure, but it was one that did a lot of damage. I'll give you one example. You had the Lithuanians in Ruhr province, and you had one of the other European countries, I may mistake right now, I think it was Norway, in another province. 2 lead nations, 2 PRTs in 2 separate provinces, each doing development work, because the PRTs was supposed to put emphasis on development than on military, though most militaries, though the spending was predominantly on the military and lack of development expertise as well. So what would happen is the Lithuanians would spend throughout their time something like $425,000, and the Norwegians spent something like $4.5 million. That's 2 provinces. During their tenure, one gets $500,000 and the other one gets $4.5 million. So you see the discrepancy, right? So when I was mentioning ISAF and NATO so much in my speech, it was because I wanted to show to you where inclusive security was not implemented, and give you these 2 particular examples: lead nation strategy and PRTs. So you must take a look at that. But to answer your question, the points that I mentioned at the UN Security Council for Afghan women when it comes to the peace process, there is a lot of fears and concerns that their basic fundamental rights are going to be eroded when there is a peace agreement, because one of the elements of the peace agreement will be the revision of the Afghan constitution. The constitution of 2004, under the auspice of the international community, is one of the most progressive constitutions we have in the country, also based on the Constitution of 1965. And this constitution entrenches gives equality before the law for all Afghan citizens and women's rights in every area. The fear is that if a peace agreement comes about, the constitution will be revised. Now, President Ghani, in his offer of peace to the Taliban in February, did state that there were certain red lines, certain things that would not be negotiated, and giving women's rights as one of those. However, he also mentioned that the constitution will be revised through a constitutional mechanism. So I asked a few people what this constitutional mechanism is, and they said, remember when I mentioned earlier the lawyer jirga? So if a lawyer jirga is brought about in the country and the constitution is put before the table, they can bring any changes there. Neither the international community will be able to do anything about it, and nor will the civil society or people of Afghanistan. And that is on the table. So whenever we're sitting, civil society with the international community, particularly the EU, which really is fighting hard to build a consensus and to make sure these rights are not rolled back, we tell them that this is the danger. So women in Afghanistan, do not have a role in the peace process. No substantial role, only a symbolic role. B, there are definite threats to their constitutional rights if a peace agreement is brought about. And 3, whether we look at it from a reconciliation or a reintegration of, let's say, reintegration of foot soldiers at the subnational level, both threaten to roll back whatever progress women have made in terms of whether it's education or employment and work. To be able to ensure this does not happen, we have to make sure that women are represented at the negotiation table when and if talks happen.
Thank you. Other questions? Sybille, you were, yeah? So.
Thank you. Not only about Afghanistan, but in general, the question of, well, the tension between the aim to have an inclusive approach to security, meaning to have women actively participating, really participating in peace negotiations on the one hand, and on the other hand, putting them under risk. So for an implementation agency, it would be interesting to hear. I mean, how can we really deal with such maybe contradictions or with risks? I mean, acknowledging the risks, but at the same time not withdrawing too much from our aim. Thank you.
Sybille, you were also nodding during Mariam's speech. Maybe you wouldn't want to take up on this.
I think you answered it already. I think there is not the answer to it, but I think the acknowledgement that there are vulnerabilities for women who would participate at all levels is key to it. And I think I was like in touch with the people who did the TRC hearings in Liberia, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They did, and I think that they found a very good way to do it. They traveled the country and really kind of went into very small villages and organized women's hearings. And then they kind of built up what they saw and brought it again to the national level. And they were doing the hearings in spaces where then only women were allowed to go in, and so they tried to do it in a way that it was kind of not putting them too much at risk, and then also collecting it from villages to town and then again to the national level. But I think what you are saying, that the most important is to recognize this and it's not only, I mean, it's not only security, it's also like all these things why women can't participate, like provide, I mean, that's the tiny things you say, but provide them with a possibility to have their children taken care of during the hearings where they participate, have possibilities for them to be mobile, because they are often not, and then many of the women are not even allowed to go out of the house and to another village, so you have to negotiate this beforehand. So it's a whole lot. It sounds easy, participation of women, and you get them all around the table, but when you look in the tiny details, it's really hard. And I think in our experience, you can't do it without involvement of the local women's NGOs, because in all places where we are, there are women already organizing, whether it's formal or informally, and they know what is needed for women to participate, how to organize it, where to organize it, what's the best place. They can talk to the men in the communities. So for us, the key is to really kind of organize it already with those who are there, and not come from outside and then try to find the solution. Yeah. You want to add to it?
Maybe just also to respond to, I think, the first question. I think, yes, I mean, you did get me right. But I think in terms of managed expectations, I think I would like us, to be both more ambitious, but at the same time more realistic. And I think more ambitious also relates to what you say. We need to think in the long term. And we need to also be able to adjust if we see, okay, the situation changes, there are developments on the ground. We need to, I think, get better then also to react in a flexible way. And I think what you said, Almut, we need to know the context much, much better. So the analysis is, and to react upon the analysis, I think is absolutely crucial, and it needs to be an inclusive analysis. And I think what was mentioned just in the panel before in terms of including a gender perspective that is not only about a woman's perspective, but I think really look at also gender dynamics, social dynamics, issues of inequality, power structures that go beyond men and women, but look at other factors as well, needs to be the basis of what we do, and I think we can do a lot better.
Thank you. I think you gave us perfect closing remarks because unfortunately our time is already up. I urge you to take your questions and discussion points into the coffee break, which is starting now. Thank you very much for your participation. Also, thank you to our remarkable speakers. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you.